to Tokyo. This is a story about an unbelievable experience that happened to one man. The story begins in spring, several years ago. Our protagonist, Kenta, graduated from a high school in the countryside and was accepted into a university in Tokyo, which had been his dream. He was 18 years old that spring. Like many young people, Kenta had high hopes for his new life in the big city. 2 weeks before the entrance ceremony, Kenta came to Tokyo with his parents and rented a small apartment in Suginami Ward. It was an old three-story building, about 20 years old. Kenta rented a corner room on the top floor, the third floor. A single six-tatami room. It wasn't spacious by any means, but it was enough for a college student starting to live alone. From the window, he could see the peaceful scenery of a residential neighborhood. His parents, looking worried, repeated their warnings over and over again. Always lock your doors properly. Don't let strangers into your room. If you have any trouble, contact us immediately. Kenta felt a bit annoyed by his parents' words, but he nodded obediently. After his parents left, Kenta looked around his new living space, now all alone. A small refrigerator, a two-burner stove, a closet and a brand new dresser placed against the wall. Everything was fresh, and everything was his own. At this moment, Kenta truly felt it. The pure anticipation for the free and fulfilling college life that was about to begin. The entrance ceremony was blessed with clear weather. The new students gathered in the auditorium all had tense expressions, yet somehow filled with hope. Kenta was one of them. After the ceremony, when the new student orientation began, he gradually started talking with students around him. Students from the same department, students interested in the same clubs, students from nearby hometowns. There were various encounters, and Kenta gradually became accustomed to life in Tokyo. Living alone in the apartment was going more smoothly than he had expected. He would wake up by himself in the morning, make a simple breakfast, and head to university. After classes, he would either review and prepare in the library, or go out to eat with his new friends. Even when he came home late at night, no one would complain. This freedom to decide everything on his own felt comfortable. However, there was one thing that concerned Kenta. It was about Daiki, his best friend from high school. Daiki had also enrolled in a Tokyo university that spring, just like Kenta. And surprisingly, the apartment Daiki rented was only about a 10-minute walk from Kenta's room. In high school, the two were very close and often hung out together on holidays. Daiki was always cheerful and energetic. No matter what difficulties he faced, he would overcome them with a positive attitude and a smile. Kenta had been encouraged many times by Daiki's demeanor. In Tokyo too, they would surely spend more time together. Kenta thought so and looked forward to reuniting with Daiki. On the day of the entrance ceremony, Kenta searched for Daiki in the auditorium but couldn't find him. Daiki's university was in a different location, and their entrance ceremony dates were different. After that, Kenta sent several emails to Daiki. However, the replies were all curt. Busy, maybe next time. Only such short words came back. The Daiki from high school would have replied more talkatively and cheerfully. Kenta felt a bit lonely, but he thought Daiki must be desperately trying to adapt to his new environment. So he decided to wait for the day when they could meet leisurely. A month had passed since enrollment. Golden Week was approaching, and the city was gradually taking on the atmosphere of early summer. Kenta's college life was completely on track. He had gotten used to classes, made more friends, and started club activities. Every day was fulfilling, and every day was fresh. At this time, Kenta still didn't know the unimaginable terror that was about to happen to him, and that it would be his most trusted best friend, Daiki, who would pull the trigger of that terror. One evening, when Kenta returned from university and was relaxing as usual, it happened. His cell phone suddenly rang. A call from a friend. A familiar name appeared on the cell phone screen. Daiki. Kenta was a bit surprised but felt happy as he answered the phone. Hello, Daiki? Long time no see. Kenta spoke in a cheerful voice. However, the voice that came from the other end of the phone was somehow different from the Daiki's voice he knew. Ah, Kenta, sorry for the sudden call. The voice was strangely hoarse and lacked energy. It was like the voice of someone who hadn't slept in a long time, utterly exhausted. What's wrong? Are you feeling sick? Kenta asked worriedly. No, it's not that. Daiki's words trailed off. On the other end of the phone, there was some sound. A rustling sound, like touching paper or something. Then Daiki continued. Hey, Kenta, could you come stay at my place tonight? Kenta was puzzled by the sudden request. Tonight? That's sudden. Did something happen? No, not really. It's just, I wanted to see you after so long. There was a strange tension in Daiki's voice, as if he was hiding something, or as if he was afraid of something. That was the impression Kenta got. But I have classes from tomorrow morning, so couldn't we just drink together at my place instead? Kenta wanted to decline if possible. It wasn't for any particular reason. He just felt that Daiki's condition was somehow not normal, which made him feel a bit uneasy. Please, Kenta, I really need you to come tonight. Daiki's voice became even more urgent. Come stay at my place. Please. There was a pleading tone in his voice. The Daiki from high school, who had been so cheerful and dependable, now seemed like a completely different person. Kenta hesitated. However, he couldn't refuse his best friend's request. Okay, what time should I come? It would help if you could come right now. Thank you so much, Kenta, Daiki said in a relieved voice. Then the phone call ended. Kenta stared at his cell phone, feeling conflicted. He had a very bad feeling about this. However, if a friend was in trouble, it was natural to help. Kenta packed some simple luggage in his bag and left his room. It was a little past 8 o'clock in the evening. The May night still retained a bit of chill. He left the apartment and walked down the narrow road of the residential area. The dim road where streetlights were intermittently interrupted. The park that was lively with children's voices during the day was now empty. Only the swing swayed in the wind, making a creaking sound. As Kenta headed toward Daiki's apartment, he recalled their high school days. Preparing for the cultural festival together, encouraging each other at club tournaments, rejoicing on graduation day about going to universities in Tokyo together. Daiki back then was always smiling. At any time, he was positive and lifted the spirits of those around him. Yet today's voice on the phone seemed like a completely different person. Had life in Tokyo brought some change to Daiki, or was he struggling with some serious problem? Kenta continued walking, feeling anxious. After about 10 minutes of walking, he arrived at Daiki's apartment. An old 3-story building similar to the apartment where Kenta lived. The exterior walls were slightly faded, and there was only one vending machine on the first floor. Daiki's room was the second from the back on the second floor. Kenta climbed the stairs and stood in front of that room. On the door hung a nameplate with Daiki's name. Kenta took a deep breath and pressed the intercom. Immediately, the door opened. It was as fast as if someone had been waiting right in front of the door. And then Kenta saw it. A bizarre scene he had never seen before. The strange room. The moment the door opened, Kenta gasped. An unbelievable scene spread before him. The entire room was covered with packing tape. The boundary between the window frame and the wall. The gap between the door and the floor. The part where the ceiling met the walls. The edges of the closet door. Around the air conditioner. The base of the light fixture. Every single gap imaginable was sealed with brown packing tape, layer upon layer. It was as if someone was trying to completely seal the room. Kenta was at a loss for words. Oh, you came. Thank you, Daiki said in a faint voice. Kenta finally looked at Daiki's face, and he was shocked once again. The person standing before him was certainly Daiki. However, he looked nothing like the Daiki that Kenta knew. His cheeks were sunken, and there were deep dark circles under his eyes. His hair had grown long and unkempt, and he had stubble on his face. His body was noticeably emaciated. The Daiki from high school was good at sports and had a solid build. He always had a tanned face and looked the picture of health. But now, the Daiki standing before him looked like someone who had been suffering from a long illness. Daiki, are you okay? Kenta asked, unable to hide his concern. Yeah, I'm fine. Daiki smiled weakly. However, that smile had none of its former brightness. But this room, what happened? Why all this packing tape? Kenta asked while looking around the room. Up close, the abnormality stood out even more. The packing tape wasn't just stuck on. It was layered obsessively, over and over again, as if not even the tiniest gap could be allowed to remain. This is just a kind of mood change, you know, Daiki answered while looking away. Mood change? This? Kenta asked back in disbelief. Yeah, mood change. Don't worry about it, Kenta. Daiki seemed to be trying to act cheerful by force. However, his voice was trembling. Kenta realized that Daiki's condition was not normal. He must be dealing with some serious problem. Hey, Daiki, what happened? Tell me. Kenta placed his hand on Daiki's shoulder. Daiki's body was surprisingly thin and bony. Nothing at all, really, Daiki answered without looking into Kenta's eyes. But you're clearly not yourself. What are you trying to protect yourself from by doing this to your room? Kenta pressed further. Daiki remained silent for a while. The room was eerily quiet, since the windows and gaps were all sealed. No sound from outside could be heard. It was as if they were in a space cut off from the world. Don't worry about it. I'm fine. Daiki finally spoke, but his answer was vague. You're not fine. Are you eating properly? Are you going to university? Kenta fired off questions one after another. However, Daiki just shook his head and didn't answer. Kenta didn't know what to do. Daiki clearly needed help. That's why he had called him here. But he wouldn't talk about what he was suffering from or what he feared. Anyway, come in. You're staying the night, right? Daiki tried to forcibly change the subject. Kenta felt it would be useless to press further, and decided to enter the room for now. When he took off his shoes and entered, he noticed that packing tape was also stuck in several places on the floor. The gaps between the floorboards, the boundary between the baseboard and floor, everything was carefully sealed. 2 simple futons were laid out in the room. probably prepared for Kenta. Sorry for calling you suddenly, but I'm really glad you came, Daiki said while sitting on the futon. Relief showed on his face, but at the same time, deep fatigue and some indescribable fear were also evident. Kenta sat down next to Daiki. Then he suddenly noticed something. Daiki's gaze occasionally turned toward a corner of the room, as if something were there, or as if he was watching for something coming from there. Kenta looked in that direction, but there was nothing there. Just a wall sealed with packing tape and a dresser. Hey, Kenta, Daiki suddenly said in a small voice. You'll stay with me tonight, right? His voice contained a childlike anxiety. Yeah, of course. I'll stay with you until morning, Kenta answered, trying to reassure him as much as possible. Daiki nodded slightly. Then he stared at the corner of the room again. In those eyes dwelt a deep fear that Kenta couldn't understand. A nightmarish night. That night, the two of them chatted about trivial matters for a while. Daiki seemed to be trying to act as normal as possible. About university classes, about the new club he had joined, about life in Tokyo. However, the conversation was somehow awkward and unnatural. Daiki's eyes seemed to be constantly on guard for something, unable to concentrate on the conversation. Around 11 o'clock at night, Daiki said, "Let's go to sleep soon." Kenta nodded, and they each got into their futons. Daiki turned off the room light. However, it didn't become completely dark. Since the windows were sealed with packing tape, there wasn't even light leaking through the curtain gaps from the streetlights. Instead, Daiki turned on a small night light. Its faint glow created eerie shadows in the room. Kenta closed his eyes in his futon. However, he couldn't sleep. The strange atmosphere of this room, Daiki's abnormal condition, and above all, a strange sense of unease enveloped Kenta. It was the sensation of being watched by someone. Kenta quietly opened his eyes and looked around the room. In the dim light of the night light, the walls, sealed with packing tape, created strange patterns. The shadow of the dresser was cast large on the wall, but there was nothing else. Next to him, he could hear Daiki's sleeping breath. Kenta told himself it was just his imagination and closed his eyes again. How much time had passed? Kenta was beginning to doze off. That's when it happened. Watching, a faint voice was heard. Kenta opened his eyes with a start. Watching. It was Daiki's voice, sleep-talking. However, this sleep-talking wasn't ordinary. Clear fear was contained in it. Watching. Daiki repeated the same words over and over. The voice gradually grew louder. Then suddenly, "Oh!" Daiki screamed and jumped up. Kenta was also startled and sat up. "Daiki, what's wrong?" Kenta called out to Daiki. Daiki was breathing heavily, staring at a corner of the room. His eyes were wide with terror. His entire body was trembling slightly. "Daiki, did you have a nightmare? Are you okay?" Kenta placed his hand on Daiki's shoulder. Daiki's body was drenched in sweat. "Oh, yeah, a dream, just a dream." Daiki finally turned toward Kenta. However, his eyes seemed unfocused. "Are you okay? Want some water?" Kenta asked gently. "No, I'm fine. Sorry for waking you." Daiki said that and lay back down on his futon. Kenta also returned to his futon. However, a few minutes later, the same thing happened again. Watching. Daiki's sleep-talking began, and then he would jump up with a scream. This repeated over and over. Every 10 minutes, sometimes every 5 minutes, Daiki would fall asleep, be attacked by nightmares, and jump up repeatedly. Each time, Kenta would wake up and try to calm Daiki down. However, Daiki never explained anything. He just kept repeating, "I'm fine." Kenta gradually became anxious. There's something in this room, isn't there? Something that Daiki fears exists in this room. Such thoughts crossed his mind, and Kenta himself began to be seized by a strange sensation. Being watched by someone. Yes, someone was definitely staring at them. Kenta looked around the room many times. However, there was no one in the room except the two of them. The windows sealed with packing tape. The closed door, the closet and inside the dresser weren't places where someone could hide. Yet he felt a gaze, especially from the direction of the dresser. Kenta stared intently at the dresser. Between the dresser and the wall, there was a slight gap. Less than 5 centimeters, truly a small gap. Only that spot wasn't sealed with packing tape. Probably Daiki hadn't noticed it either. Or perhaps he couldn't reach it. Kenta stared at that gap. It was dark and he couldn't see anything. However, he definitely felt it. From beyond that gap, something was looking this way. Such an irrational sensation. Kenta instinctively pulled the futon over his head, and he just kept waiting for morning to come. It was a long night. Finally, through the gap in the window, a faint light began to seep in. Morning had come. Kenta got up with his exhausted body. He hadn't slept at all. Looking beside him, Daiki was also awake. His face looked even more worn out. "Kenta," Daiki said in a faint voice. "Thank you, truly thank you." Then tears fell from Daiki's eyes. "Last night, because you were with me, it really helped," Daiki said with a trembling voice. Kenta didn't know what to say. Daiki was clearly suffering from something, but he wouldn't talk about it. Daiki, are you really okay? Shouldn't you talk to someone? Kenta asked worriedly. I'm fine. I'm fine now, Daiki answered while wiping away his tears. However, those words had no persuasive power whatsoever. Kenta prepared to leave in the morning and departed from Daiki's room. Daiki saw him off at the door. I'll contact you again. Thank you so much. Daiki said that and waved his hand slightly. Kenta descended the stairs with conflicted feelings. When he went outside, the fresh morning air enveloped him. An ordinary, casual morning scene. People commuting to work, students heading to school. Everything was everyday normalcy. However, an indelible sense of unease remained in Kenta's heart. That gaze he felt in that room last night. And Daiki's sleep-talking, watching. What exactly was tormenting Daiki? Kenta continued to ponder as he walked the path to his apartment. And at this time, Kenta still didn't know that the one night he had just spent had greatly changed his life. That the time spent in that room had brought about irreversible consequences. The beginning of the gaze. When Kenta returned to his room, he first took a shower. The warm water loosened his body that had been tense all night. However, the sense of unease in his heart did not disappear. After getting out of the shower, as he began to relax in his room as usual, it happened. Kenta was seized by a strange sensation. Being watched by someone. That was the feeling. Kenta instinctively looked around, but naturally, he was the only one in the room. The television, a small refrigerator, the bookshelf, the dresser, the familiar scenery of his room, unchanged as always. I must be tired. Kenta told himself that. He hadn't slept at all last night. Daiki's abnormal condition, the bizarre atmosphere of that room. Such things must be making his nerves hypersensitive. Kenta decided to think this way. That day, he decided to skip his university classes. He just wanted to sleep. He laid out his futon and lay down. Despite being tired, he couldn't fall asleep easily, because that sensation still remained. Being watched, someone is staring at him. Kenta tossed and turned many times, and finally, he fell into a light sleep. He woke up in the evening. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to turn orange. Kenta sat up and stretched. He seemed to have rested a bit. However, the moment he woke up, that sensation was there again. A gaze. Definitely, someone was looking at him. This time, Kenta decided to investigate thoroughly. First, he opened the closet. Futons and cardboard boxes were inside. Nothing else. Next, he peered under the bed. Some dust had accumulated, but again, nothing was there. He checked behind the curtains too. Outside the window, he could only see the wall of the apartment across the way. Kenta's room was on the third floor. The possibility of being peeped at from outside was almost none. He also opened the dresser. Only folded clothes inside. He checked behind the bookshelf. He looked behind the refrigerator. But nowhere, no one was there. It must be my imagination after all. Kenta breathed a sigh of relief. However, that relief didn't last long. The next day and the day after that, he continued to feel the gaze. And it grew stronger with each passing day. At first, it was just a feeling he had from time to time. However, gradually, it became a constant sensation of being watched. When he came home from university and was relaxing in his room. When he was watching television. When he was reading a book. When he was eating. Always, someone's gaze was directed at him. Kenta gradually became restless. What on earth was this? Where was this gaze coming from? Kenta searched his room over and over again. But still, he found nothing. Then one day, Kenta realized something important. The gaze had a direction. Yes, the gaze always came from the same direction. Kenta tried carefully to identify that direction. When watching television, he felt the gaze. That gaze came from the left. When eating, he felt the gaze too. Again, from the left. When reading a book, it was the same. Kenta slowly looked in that direction. There stood the dresser placed against the wall. The dresser. Kenta had checked inside the dresser many times, but there was nothing but clothes. Then, behind the dresser, Kenta tried to move the dresser. However, it was heavy and he couldn't move it alone. The side of the dresser? Kenta tried to peek at the side of the dresser. Between the dresser and the wall, there was a slight gap. Less than 10 centimeters, truly a small gap. Kenta stared at that gap. It was dark and he couldn't see anything. However, he definitely felt it. The gaze was coming from there. Kenta used his cell phone's light to illuminate that gap. The light shone into the depths of the narrow gap. There was only a wall. Of course, it was between the dresser and the wall, after all. Kenta thought he was overthinking it. However, the gaze did not disappear. No, rather, with each passing day, the gaze grew stronger. Kenta gradually became mentally cornered. At night, when he tried to sleep, he felt the gaze and couldn't sleep. He was fine while at university, but as soon as he returned to his room, that sensation would come back. His friends began to notice that something was wrong with Kenta. Kenta, you haven't seemed well lately, are you okay? He was asked this several times. However, Kenta couldn't tell anyone about this abnormal experience. Even if he told them, they wouldn't believe him. He himself thought it was ridiculous. However, there was one person who might understand this sensation. Daiki. Daiki was also afraid of something. He had sealed his entire room with packing tape. Perhaps Daiki was having a similar experience. Kenta tried to contact Daiki, but when he called, Daiki didn't answer. When he sent emails, there was no reply. Daiki had completely cut off contact. Kenta was alone, and he was terrified. What was this gaze? Why did it keep staring at him? He couldn't find the answer. However, there was one thing that was certain. The direction of the gaze definitely came from the direction of the dresser. From that small gap between the dresser and the wall, Kenta began to stare at that gap. He felt like there was an answer there somehow. And finally, that day came. The day when Kenta would see something he should never have seen. What lies in the gap? It was the night exactly 1 week after staying at Daiki's room. Kenta had reached his limit. The gaze grew stronger day by day, and now it never left him, not even for a moment. Food wouldn't go down his throat properly. He couldn't sleep. Always, someone was staring at him. That sensation was consuming Kenta. That night, Kenta made a decision. He would settle this now. He would confirm the true nature of the gaze with his own eyes. It was past 2 in the morning. The room was completely silent. From outside, only the occasional sound of a car driving by could be heard. Kenta stared at the dresser from inside his futon. The gaze was definitely coming from there. The gap between the dresser and the wall. From that small gap, only about 5 centimeters wide, Kenta slowly crawled out of his futon. His heart was pounding violently. His hands were trembling. However, Kenta approached the dresser step by step. 3 steps, 2 steps, 1 step. He stood in front of the dresser. Then Kenta knelt down and peered into the gap between the dresser and the wall. At first, he couldn't see anything. There was only darkness. However, as his eyes adjusted, he noticed that faint light was illuminating the depths of the gap. Light from the next room must be leaking through a gap in the wall. And in that faint light, Kenta saw it. Eyes. Human eyes were there. A woman's eyes, staring intently at him. Those eyes didn't blink, just continuously, endlessly stared at Kenta. All the blood drained from Kenta's body. Kenta screamed. He stood up and staggered backward. However, those eyes still continued to stare at Kenta. From the depths of the gap, Kenta bolted out of the room. He ran down the hallway and rushed down the stairs. When he got outside, the cold night air enveloped him. Kenta, out of breath, kept running. His destination was a nearby convenience store. At the late-night convenience store, there were a few customers. Kenta went straight into the store and headed to the stationery corner. Then he picked up all the packing tape that was there. Brown packing tape, clear packing tape, cloth packing tape. He put every single roll of packing tape in the store into his shopping basket. The cashier looked at Kenta suspiciously. A young man coming to buy a large amount of packing tape. In the middle of the night, no matter how you looked at it, it was a strange sight. However, the clerk said nothing and silently completed the transaction. Kenta left the store carrying a large bag full of packing tape. And he started running again. To his apartment. To that room. He ran up the stairs and opened the door. Inside the room, everything was silent. However, Kenta knew. It was still there. From the depths of the gap, still staring at him. Kenta opened the bag of packing tape with trembling hands. Then he first headed to the gap between the dresser and the wall. He didn't peer into the gap. He didn't want to see it. He never wanted to see those eyes again. Kenta pulled out the packing tape and began sticking it over the gap. 1 layer, 2 layers, 3 layers. He layered the packing tape over and over again. Absolutely no gap must remain. Not even a millimeter of gap could be allowed. Kenta continued working desperately. After sealing the gap between the dresser and the wall, he began sealing other places. The boundary between the window frame and the wall. The gaps in the door. The part where the ceiling met the walls. The edges of the closet door. The gap between the floor and the baseboard. Around the air conditioner. Around the outlets. Kenta sealed every gap. The work continued for hours. Kenta's fingers were red and swollen from continuously pulling out packing tape. However, he couldn't stop. He had to seal them. Every gap had to be completely sealed. If he didn't, it would keep watching. Kenta was driven by such an obsession. And while working, Kenta realized, even after sealing the gap by the dresser, the gaze hadn't disappeared. No, it felt the same as before it was sealed. Someone was staring at him. It was no longer from the dresser gap. From somewhere else. From another gap somewhere in the room. It kept watching. From somewhere, it would always keep watching. Kenta, trembling with fear, continued working. He sealed the closet gaps, the window gaps, the door gaps. The packing tape was rapidly depleting. But it still wasn't enough. There must still be unsealed gaps. Kenta looked around the room. And whenever he found a new gap, he sealed it with packing tape. The base of the light fixture. Between the bookshelf and the wall. Around the refrigerator. Everything had to be sealed. Eventually, morning light began to seep faintly through the gaps in the window. Sealed with packing tape, Kenta sat down on the floor. The room was no longer Kenta's room. It was exactly the same scene as Daiki's room. Every gap sealed with brown packing tape. A bizarre, insane room. Kenta understood that he had become the same as Daiki, and he despaired, because he knew that gaze he felt in Daiki's room. He could now feel the same thing in his own room. Even if he sealed the gaps with packing tape, the gaze wouldn't disappear. It would watch from anywhere. No matter how much he sealed, it would always watch from some gap. Kenta held his head in his hands. What would become of him from now on? Would he have to live with this gaze for the rest of his life? And then Kenta remembered Daiki's words. Thank you so much. Those words of gratitude said while crying. No way. Could it be that was? A chill ran down Kenta's spine. However, before he could pursue that thought further, Kenta's consciousness faded due to exhaustion. He collapsed on the floor and fell into a deep sleep. Inescapable terror. He woke up in the evening. Kenta had been sleeping collapsed on the floor. His entire body ached. He slowly sat up and looked around the room. The room covered completely with packing tape. It was reality. This was not a dream. And Kenta realized the gaze still hadn't disappeared. Definitely, someone was staring at him. No way. Kenta was stunned. He had sealed every gap so thoroughly. He had spent hours sealing everything perfectly. Why was he still being watched? Kenta searched for the direction of the gaze. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the window. Kenta approached the window. The boundary between the window frame and the wall was certainly sealed with packing tape. However, looking closely, the edge of the packing tape was slightly peeling. Just a few millimeters, but there was definitely a gap there. Kenta hurriedly stuck new packing tape over it. The gaze seemed to weaken a bit. However, it didn't completely disappear. Kenta began searching the entire room. Then he found several other places where the packing tape was starting to peel off. It was an old apartment. The walls were warped, and it might be impossible to perfectly seal all gaps. Kenta began applying packing tape again. However, it was an endless task. Kenta called Daiki. There were things he wanted to talk about, things he wanted to confirm. However, the phone just kept ringing and no one answered. No matter how many times he called, it was the same. Daiki had completely cut off contact. Kenta was alone. He couldn't consult anyone about this abnormal situation. Even if he told them, they wouldn't believe him. Worse, they would think he had gone mentally unstable. Kenta could no longer go to university. He was afraid to leave the room. What if someone entered his room while he was gone? What if the packing tape peeled off? He was seized by such anxieties. At night too, he couldn't sleep. There was no way he could sleep while feeling that gaze. Kenta spent all day checking every corner of the room and repeatedly reapplying packing tape. And he noticed something terrifying. The location of the gaze was changing. He no longer felt the gaze from the gap he had definitely sealed yesterday. However, he felt a new gaze from a different location, a corner of the closet ceiling. Today, it felt like he was being watched from there. Kenta sealed that place. However, the next day, he felt the gaze from yet another location. Behind the bookshelf. The day after that, from the upper part of the door. The following day, from a corner of the floor. It was as if it was moving. When Kenta sealed a gap, it would move to another gap and continue watching from there. Kenta understood. This would never end. No matter how many gaps he sealed, it would always watch from somewhere. Perfectly sealing the room was impossible. Kenta gradually became more and more cornered. He could hardly eat anymore. He couldn't sleep either. When he looked in the mirror, he saw his emaciated self. It was identical to the worn-out appearance of Daiki he had seen in that room. Kenta painfully realized he was following the same path as Daiki. If this continued, he too would break. However, he didn't know what to do. One day, Kenta made a decision. He would go see Daiki. Even if Daiki wouldn't answer the phone, he would go see him in person. Daiki might understand this situation. He might know some solution. Kenta decided to leave his room for the first time in a while. He tidied his appearance in front of the mirror. Long hair, stubble, sunken eyes. Even he was surprised at how much he had changed. However, now was not the time to worry about that. Kenta headed toward Daiki's apartment. It was his first time going out in 2 weeks since that fateful night. The outside world was peaceful as always. Children were playing in the park. Housewives were walking with shopping bags. Everything was normal. Only Kenta was trapped in an abnormal world. He arrived at Daiki's apartment. Kenta climbed the stairs and stood in front of Daiki's room. He pressed the intercom, but there was no response. He pressed it again. Still, no one came out. Kenta tried turning the doorknob. To his surprise, the door was unlocked. Kenta slowly opened the door. And at that moment, Kenta understood everything. The truth. The moment he opened the door, Kenta was speechless. There was a normal room spread before him. There was no packing tape at all. Bright sunlight was streaming in through the window. The walls, floor, and ceiling. Everything was clean and well organized, as if that bizarre scene had never existed in the first place. "Hey, Kenta," a voice came from the back. Daiki emerged from the kitchen. A calm smile floated on his face. Kenta doubted his own eyes. The Daiki before him was the picture of health. His complexion was good and his build was solid. That worn-out appearance was nowhere to be seen. Daiki, you. Kenta's voice trembled. What does this mean? The packing tape? Your condition? Daiki slowly approached Kenta. Then he showed a somewhat sad expression. Sorry, Kenta, Daiki said quietly. But I couldn't take it anymore. Kenta didn't understand what Daiki meant. What? What couldn't you take? Daiki breathed out deeply. The gaze. That thing staring from the gaps. I couldn't endure it anymore. A chill ran down Kenta's spine. You too. Felt that? Yeah. Daiki nodded. I was the same as you at first. One day suddenly, I felt like someone was watching me. It gradually got stronger, and finally I saw it. That woman staring from the gap. Kenta gasped. But you seem fine now. How did you? Daiki looked into Kenta's eyes. In those eyes, a mix of apologetic feelings and somehow relief. You see, Kenta, Daiki slowly continued his words. It only attaches to one person at a time. It took Kenta a few seconds to understand the meaning. One person, at a time? Right. It doesn't watch multiple people simultaneously. It always chooses just one person and keeps watching. Daiki's words echoed in Kenta's head. Then you. Yeah. Daiki nodded slightly. I also had it transferred to me from someone. From a senior in high school. That senior probably had someone stay over and transferred it too. Kenta's mind went blank, and there's only one way to transfer it. Daiki continued. Have someone stay in the room where it is. Then it will find a new host and move to them. The strength left Kenta's knees. No way. You. Sorry, Kenta. Daiki apologized once more. I called you on purpose. To transfer it to you. Kenta couldn't believe it. But we're best friends, aren't we? I know. Daiki's voice trembled slightly. I know, but I couldn't endure it anymore. Being stared at by that gaze every single day. Sleepless nights continuing. I thought I would truly break if it went on. Kenta glared at Daiki. But why? Why me? Because you were in Tokyo. Daiki answered while looking away. Because you were nearby and easy to call. And Daiki cut off his words there. Kenta didn't want to hear the rest. However, Daiki continued. Because I thought you wouldn't refuse my request. Those words deeply wounded Kenta's heart. Trust, friendship, such things had been exploited. Kenta tried to stand up. However, his legs were trembling and he couldn't stand. You know, Kenta, Daiki said gently. You can transfer it to someone too. Call someone close and have them stay over. Then you'll be free too. Kenta looked up at Daiki. I could never do something like that. You can. Daiki said quietly. I did it. At first I felt guilty, but now I don't feel anything. Because this is a curse. Someone has to bear it. If so, better it not be me. Kenta realized that the Daiki before him was no longer the Daiki he knew. That bright, kind best friend was gone. Here was a person who would readily sacrifice a friend to save himself. Kenta stood up unsteadily. Kenta, I'm really sorry. Daiki apologized once more. However, that voice didn't contain true regret. He was just apologizing out of obligation. Kenta left the room without saying anything. As he descended the stairs, tears began to flow. Was it anger? Was it sadness? Was it despair? He didn't know himself. However, one thing was certain. He now carried this curse. And the only way to escape that gaze was to transfer it to someone. However, Kenta thought, he didn't want to become like Daiki. He didn't want to sacrifice someone else just to ease his own burden. He thought this strongly. Kenta walked the path to his apartment. From behind, he definitely felt it. The gaze. That woman was still, from somewhere in a gap, staring intently at him. And that gaze would continue to watch him forever. The chain. A month had passed since then. Kenta's room was once again covered completely with packing tape. No, it was sealed even more thoroughly than before. The walls, floor, and ceiling. Everything was covered with brown packing tape. However, the gaze did not disappear. No matter how much he sealed, that woman kept watching from some gap. Kenta had reached his limit. Sleepless nights continued, and he had lost over 10 kilograms. When he looked in the mirror, he saw himself emaciated like a skeleton. He had completely withdrawn from university. He was ignoring all contact from friends. He shut himself in his room, just enduring the gaze day after day. One night, Kenta sat on the floor, staring blankly. He couldn't think about anything anymore. He just felt the gaze. Today, it felt like he was being watched from a corner of the ceiling. At that moment, his cell phone rang. Kenta looked at the screen. An unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't answer. However, that day, Kenta answered the phone for some reason. Hello. A faint voice came from his own mouth. Oh, is this Kenta? It's me, Tanaka, your junior from high school. A young man's voice came from the other end. Tanaka. Indeed, a junior from the same club in high school. Oh, Tanaka. Kenta traced his memory. Actually, I'm planning to visit Tokyo soon. And Kenta, you're still in Tokyo, right? Yeah, I am. Great. So, if possible, could I stay at your place tonight? I want to save on hotel costs. Tanaka said in a carefree voice. Kenta caught his breath. Stay over. Those words echoed in his head. Oh, tonight is a bit. Kenta started to refuse. However, Tanaka continued. Please, senior, I wanted to see you. You helped me out a lot in high school. I want to thank you properly. Kenta's hands began to tremble. Tanaka on the other end of the phone knew nothing. That this phone call might change his life. Sorry, Tanaka. Today is. Kenta was about to say that. But at that moment, the gaze became even stronger, as if urging his decision. Daiki's words revived in Kenta's head. You can transfer it to someone too. Then you'll be free. Kenta bit his lip. No, he wouldn't become like Daiki. He had decided that. Senior, can you hear me? Tanaka's voice came from the other end. Kenta, with trembling hands, hung up the phone. Then he sat down on the floor. From a gap in the corner of the room, the woman was still staring intently at Kenta today. Kenta held his head. Would he live with this gaze for the rest of his life? Or, Kenta's hand reached for his cell phone again. He looked at the call history. Tanaka's number was there. Kenta's finger, trembling, touched that number. And then, he pressed the call button. The ringtone echoed. Once, twice, 3 times. Hello, senior? Tanaka's voice was heard. Kenta closed his eyes. Then he opened his mouth. Tanaka, come over. Stay at my place tonight. From the other end, he could hear Tanaka's delighted voice. Really? Thank you so much, senior. Kenta hung up the phone. Then slowly, he looked at the corner of the room. The woman was staring from there. However, that gaze seemed to have softened just a little, as if approving of Kenta's decision. Kenta stood up, and he began peeling off the packing tape. Before Tanaka arrived, he had to return it to a normal room. The packing tape peeled off with a sound. Tears flowed from Kenta's eyes. However, he couldn't stop his hands. And so, the curse was passed on to a new victim once more. From gap to gap, from person to person, the endless chain of the gaze continues. This is where this story ends. If someone suddenly asks you, could you stay at my place tonight? You might want to be a little careful. Check if there are traces of packing tape in the corners of that room. And whether something is watching from the gaps. You should probably make sure of that. Thank you for watching.